All right. What you been working on, man?
Some server component stuff. Actually, a lot of server component stuff. Just finished the video series on Build UI for data fetching with React Server Components. That by the time this podcast is published, that series will be up and yeah, fully complete. We build a whole kind of like a user. I don't know what you call it, like an admin area for your users, so you can search users, paginate users. Cover a whole bunch of stuff, transitions, which were the last two videos, which is, I think, one of the killer features of server components and Suspense and all tying together. So yeah, it's fun. It was fun. It's a fun series and feels good to have it done, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really awesome, and I think it's cool that it came from your demo, which was a couple months ago, and obviously, like there's been work going on with on the React side with server components, and on the Next side with how they are doing things. Things like server actions came out after your first demo, but the course is focused on the data fetching side, the reading side, and none of that's changed because that was all kind of stable when you started. And so it's nice to see the way that async components work with suspense and transitions. That story is like very complete.
Hmm.
And yeah, the demo does a really good job of like showing that off.
Cool. Yeah. And then beyond that, have been doing a whole bunch of little demos with playing with server components. Basically, I think I'm going to spend like the next month or so doing a bunch of YouTube videos highlighting all these different areas of server components. So one is this await component that I shamelessly stole from the remix docs. But you always have to kind of separate whenever you want to do suspense, you have to move your data fetching into a new component so you can wrap it with suspense. And Next gives you like some convenience around here. Like they give you a loading template that's a loading.tsx that's automatically going to wrap your routes, your pages. So if your pages suspend, you don't really have to move them into a new component. You just get that loading TSX component to render. But if you have part of your page that's static and you want to immediately render it, and part of your page that's dynamic and you want to suspend, you kind of do like this weird, it's like a very awkward refactor where like you create a new component boundary, define new props, kind of move all your data fetching into that new component, now wrap that component with suspense. It's a very easy refactor, but it definitely takes you out of flow. So there's a cool component, we'll link it in the show notes, but it's this await component where you don't have to change anything about your data fetching or your component. You render await and you get a render prop that is going to let you control. It's basically a component that gets a render prop, and that render prop is going to be called when the component unsuspends, and then you can put a suspense boundary above that component. It's one of those things that's hard to describe, but when you see it, it makes a lot of sense. And if you're frustrated by all the the refactors to new component boundaries just to get suspense working, it's really a light bulb moment. At least it was for me. So yeah, very, very
Definitely.
cool.
I like stuff like that that keeps you in the flow because that's one of my favorite parts about using React. And it's one of the frictions of the server component paradigm, having to refactor to a new component boundary for client features,
Yep.
even though it makes sense and ultimately the whole trade-off feels worth it for sure. It's still a friction that wasn't there before. And so this is a nice in between for a different problem, but it's a nice in between. You have a big page, it fetches posts and comments. You want to basically defer the comments. And so instead of having to create a new comments list component, you just grab the comments query and pass it into this await component, right? That's how it
Yeah.
works. You pass it
Yep.
in as a prop, like promise or something, and that lets you carve up the UI in a new way, but still take advantage of suspense. I mean, suspense is really awesome. It's really cool to see how it works with all
Yeah.
this stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
Something else we learned going through your series and building the await component was the suspense boundaries themselves, how they work on initial render versus updates. And that was a nice light bulb moment for me. Thinking about the identity of a suspense boundary and how that's actually important. And most of the conventions in a framework like Next are made so that the identity of the suspense boundary lines up with what you would expect. But there's sometimes where, let's say the URL hasn't changed, but you would expect to see the suspense boundary re-render its fallback. But the assumption there is like we're making an update to this piece of UI instead of rendering it initially. So there's some nice learning there where the first time you render a suspense boundary for a new piece of UI, it will show its fallback. Once its children unsuspend, it will never show its fallback again. And updates to that piece of UI should use a transition if they want to show any sort of pending UI for updates to that piece of UI. And I think that's also because we use Suspense like earlier, like last year or this year, probably beginning of, what was the beginning of?
Maybe like 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I had like a little mini series on YouTube and we were learning about it. And without a framework that has a router that is suspense and transition aware, you know, it kind of behaves differently. But in the context of like the modern paradigm, you want to think about updates, and you want to think about updates to a same piece of UI differently than you think the initial render. And part of the decisions for on the both React side and the framework side have to do with what some opinions about what's best for the UX. And so if you load a list of emails, you don't have anything to show, so you need to show a fallback. But if you refresh the emails, it's likely the best UX is to see the old content while the new content is being loaded. In the same way you pull Twitter to refresh. You don't want to lose all the tweets, but you want to see a little loading indicator there that communicates that it's an update being made, but the identity of the list is still your feed. So from the perspective of the user, I'm updating something as opposed to going over to notifications, which I haven't viewed yet. Now I want to see a full screen spinner. So that was a nice light bulb moment for me in how to think about how those two pieces work together.
Yeah, very cool. It's nice that, just to kind of wrap on that, it's nice that when you start to understand how transition, suspense, and like you said, suspense boundaries all play with each other, it kind of feels like a website not built on React, in the sense when you click a link, the old screen stays rendered until the server responds with the next screen's HTML. Frameworks like Next kind of push you down that path, and you get on that path. You get on that path for free, basically. Every single interaction that you take once the app is loaded is going to be a transition. And so old content stays, new suspense boundaries aren't shown. Once the new the new screen is ready, it renders. And again, this is like, it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed and feel like all this is complicated, especially because of the new terminology. But I think that the idea that I'm trying to make is it just pushes you on a path to building a website how like normal browsers behave. But you get all the goodies like reactivity, and you're able to show some piece of loading at UI like as soon as the link is clicked. So if you want to do something like show end progress, you can do that. So it's really awesome. It's like best of both worlds.
Yes, it reminds me of a conversation we had a few podcasts ago where the baseline, MPA experience is better than the low end. The baseline for a Rails app is better than the baseline for our old Ember SPAs or Create React App SPA, because you click a link, the browser shows you you're loading, and so the user sees the browser spinner, then they see the page. They click a link next, the browser shows they're loading, but they're still able to scroll the old page. Once it's ready, it does it. For a long time, we couldn't do that with Create React App, let's say, or it's very hard to. And then now, like you said, if you make a new Next 13 app, you get that for free if you follow the conventions. And this is another just little side point. If you find yourself doing strange things like adding a key to a suspense boundary or changing the way you link to pages and it feels awkward, this is probably something that you're fighting against. And so we found if you just go with it, you get this. So you build a new app, you get that behavior for free, but then you get to enhance it. Even before you need something like state or effects, you get to enhance that experience. So something that would be very hard to do in Rails, for example, would be when I load the page, the baseline is show the white screen until it renders. But now we want to show some loading UI instantly faster than whatever is blocking that first page, the longest blocking query. And so now you can do that with loading template. That's the initial fallback for Suspense. And then, like you said, if you're navigating and doing an update, instead of just seeing the browser spinner for an update, you can use transitions to add loading or pending UI there. So I like that it layers on that pending UI piece, but it's built on the foundations of something that, you know, users come to expect from most of the web.
Yeah, closer to the baseline experience is a really good way to view it. And I think that's something that we should all strive for, especially as React developers, because it's really easy for users to get confused when it's not, when their browser doesn't behave like other websites they use.
Yep, they click a link, the screen just goes to white, or they don't see anything. All of that should be, if you follow kind of the conventions, and especially the kind of thing like the workflow that the approach you describe in the course, you should never have that. You should never have a refresh or a link click that shows no response, right? In some form. And you get pretty far with that by using Next Link and the root loading template. And so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, nice. Let's see, what other components have I been working on? So I have I worked on this video that's going to be on YouTube again by the time this is published. Where one of the things with when you're writing these like server components is when data changes, you need a way to tell your browser app that it should refresh, right? So you can imagine like, yeah, you're working on a blog. You actually, a thing that happens with us all the time is when we're working on Build UI, we are editing a summary as we're writing it. And like when we save the summary in the CMS, we then have to go over to the browser and reload it so that the browser pulls that data from the CMS and re-renders our updates. We don't have like hot module reloading across the network, across our services. And one of the cool things with server components is you can use a server action to basically look at all the data at the time of your render and then invoke a server action that can check if your data has changed. And if your data has changed, you can have your server action tell your browser that it needs to reload the page. And the really cool thing about this is when I say reload the page, I'm not talking about like a hard refresh or window.reload. I'm talking, you can have the server action, you can have the server component re-render its output, its JSX, send that down to the browser, and the browser is going to do a browser React runtime, whatever you want to call it, is going to do a diff and then update the parts of the UI that have changed. So if the user has like scroll position, or they have inputs filled out, or they have sliders, whatever, interactive components, you can refresh the server components and just get the diff rendered. You don't blow away any of their client-side state, which is really, it's so cool. I mean, it's really, really cool when you start to see this working. So just to kind of bring this back, one of the things I've been working on is a server action that you can ask the server, basically tell me when my data has changed, and the server action will invoke a reload for you, a refresh for you with one of Next's revalidate APIs. And it's really, really cool because you're not just like, you could imagine you do something where you just constantly tell the server to refresh and send you its JSX and then you just diff it. But now you're like, it's kind of strange. You're like putting like load on your server. Not even load. It's strange that your server's just constantly rendering. You can imagine you have a lot of clients and it's just rendering and inserting new JSX on the client. I think it's really cool that you can use a server action and just say, hey, only tell me to re-render when my data's changed. So yeah.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and it's like you're saying, it's a React re-render, which is part of the whole benefit and the goal of all this, is that takes care of the reconciliation, the diff, and maintains the state. So just to clarify, like, make sure I understand, going back to the conversation I had with Tim, you have actions I take and then actions someone else takes. This falls in the second bucket. So the first bucket, if you're making a change through the same application, through the React app, the solution there would be at the point of the change for that ultimately server action, which would be the goal. is the mechanism by which you make a mutation to call revalidate, one of the revalidate APIs at the point of mutation. And then you don't, this is not a problem in theory in the future state. If I'm editing a name and I hit save, then I don't have to worry about any of this because I know I changed my name, I revalidate a name, and so the whole caching layer from the front to back is going to take care of showing the correct updates in the UI, right?
Yes, but I think this is one of those things like in reality, sure, that story sounds great, except when you go over to our stuff, that doesn't work because we're not making edits on our website. We're using
that's why it falls in the second bucket,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not an action I take because it's not a mutation that is being originated from the current app. It's equivalent to somebody else having the browser open on another computer and making a change. It's like a backend system change.
Yeah, I know what you're trying to get at, but yes, I know what you're trying to get at. I think that language is confusing because it is an action you take in the sense that you have the CMS open and you're editing.
Yeah.
The point here is the action isn't going through the Next.js app. So the Next.js app basically has no idea that the data changed. So how do you, given that there's an external system, how can you tell the data changed? And I think one of like your first instincts is like, well, I'll just refresh. And that's actually what we do on Build UI today. We just constantly refresh the page because we can't tell if data in the external system has changed. Yes. If you
maybe there's a better term for user.
Ever have forms on your site and the only way to edit data on your site is through a form on your site, then you can control the cache through your site. But as soon as you use something like an external service or like PHP My Admin, any like DB admin thing, you kind of have to figure out, well, how do I communicate these updates back to my site?
Right. So, and it's the same problem space. Let's say if I had a Remix app that used Prism on a local database, I have a form where I create a new entry. Remix is automatically going to rerun those loaders. But if I had the site open and someone else opens it and makes a change, it's kind of the same problem space there. How do I know that somebody else made the change? And in theory, this would be a similar approach that you could use. So basically the way it does it is,
how would you do this in Remix?
I think you would do exactly the same thing you did. If you wanted the UI to update because of a new data in the backend, but not because of an action that the current user session took, like navigating or submitting a form, what are your options, right? It's kind of the same problem. So either you pull in some way, or, what have we done in the past? Firebase, you have WebSocket, notifies the front end, something's changed, just re-renders. So you basically have, it's the same problem space, it's the same solution set. And so I think yours is a good one as like a high level way to approach this. And it's funny, right? Because this is back to like MPA versus SPA. If someone's navigating around a site, it feels stranger in Build UI because the backend is being edited by the same person, but ultimately it's the same thing where if you're not clicking a link or submitting a form in the UI and something changed that powers that page, does the user expect it to change, or do they not?
Yeah, I mean,
so if you're using a rich app like Twitter, the baseline is raised, right? So if you're using an app like Twitter and you're just reading and you have new tweets, users have come to expect, there's 50 new tweets to just show up, even though they didn't do anything. And so that's kind of the same thing here. And so I think the polling and checking for new data is a nice high-level way to think about an easy way to solve this problem without adding new tech that is like a WebSocket or a log event bus or anything like that. And what's cool about your solution, the unique, I think the kind of insightful thing, clever thing there, is that instead of just polling and re-rendering, you can pull. And first, it's cool that the React server components are being rendered on the server. So it's not like you have to do a get and have any logic on the client to figure out anything at all. Second, you pull, and what you're checking is the updated app part of the data, the dynamic data that's driving the page. And if that changed, you're already on the server, you know it's different, and you re-render it, and then you get the diff, and React takes care of rendering the rest, which is why it all comes together so nicely. And so I think that's a cool way to think about solving the problem. And then you could get even fancier if you wanted to do like a buffered state, you know, and show that it's been updated the way like Stack Overflow, if you're editing a question, this is the same problem space.
Twitter's really good here.
Twitter's good, but I like the Stack Overflow case because that's the case where you would want to enhance the UI because you're editing a version of the question that's now stale. That's really important for the user, but it's also a situation where you wouldn't want to blow away the client-side state. You want to let them know. It's like the initial versus update case. It's a different path that's important to the user. So you actually want to show a message that says this question's been updated, and I think there's some cool abstractions there that you could do where you pull, you see the updated as changed, and now how do you handle that situation? Do you React re-render? Because if I'm looking at a summary, that's fine. I just update it. Or do I show some new UI, you know?
This is an area where server actions are awesome because the server action that you're asking, has my data changed, can respond and say, hey, yeah, it has changed. And now you can get that in client-side land, set state, show a toast, do whatever you want. So you have full power. It's like calling a function and just getting that function available to you in your client component and doing whatever you want with the data. So
I'm getting some cool ideas for recipes here.
Yeah, and the nice thing is like it's not like understanding
inversion of control. It's like a nice inversion of control.
Yeah, where just asking the server has this changed because the server is the best person to answer that thing to answer that question, and then the server can respond with true, and then the client can the client is the best person to answer. What do I do?
Exactly.
When
it's changed. Exactly. Yeah. That's the inversion control bar because the client knows if you're editing or you're viewing or whatever. So
very cool. I do like that once you kind of learn this flow, that there's so many different ways to apply it. So you're not just call
router.refresh.
You know, I've done things. Yeah, exactly. I've done things that like they pull the backend for a new version and then they just do a full page reload when a new version's been deployed. But you don't really all you get there is just this kind of like high level thing. You don't get to decide what's best for your app. And the thing I love about the server action returning data is you get to decide what's best for your app, how often to check.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, just to go back to what you said, it is if all your edits are going through your app, you don't need something like this.
And people might reach for it because it can be confusing, but as Tim pointed out, the right way to do it is if you're having a mutation through your app, that mutation should also be notifying the system to revalidate. And that's, that is been a friction and a sticking point and a point of confusion for people. And maybe there'll be some day where by default, the caching is off instead of on, and you opt in as you go through these things. But right now, if you were to make a change, so you make a mutation through the app, but you forget the revalidate APIs, and then you click a link to go back home, you don't see your changes. That's because of caching. It's not because you need to call router refresh in the client, even though that might be like if I refresh the page, it works. So I guess my component needs to call router.refresh. No, the problem there is you need to call revalidate in the server since you've made an action, since you've made a mutation, right? And then when you go back home, you'll see the new data.
Yeah, I know. This is I understand what you're saying, and it's factually correct.
But it's confusing.
No, but no. But data doesn't change through your app. So that's the first kind of problem I have. Just data doesn't change through your app. I know that's a very.
You mean if you have a CMS?
Dude, think about all the apps you work on. Data doesn't change through your app. This is
sure.
You're making a theoretical argument, which your and Tim's argument here is totally theoretical, and I totally buy. You have a form. Actually, let's talk about Remix first.
It's the same. I was going to say even just talk about Rails connected to Contentful. It's the same problem.
No, it's not. It's not, because Rails Rails is going to get a new piece of data. But let's talk about Remix for a second, because the way that Remix works is when you submit a form, you call an action, all of your loaders are going to rerun. So
Yes.
you as a user don't have to think about the cache and calling revalidate.
The cache, yes.
So they get you closer to that baseline MPA experience. But there's a trade-off here that all your loaders have to rerun.
Yes.
So now, like, I don't know, maybe some data updates that you didn't want to update, or your loaders are slow. I mean, there's just like, again, there's trade-offs, but it gets you closer to that baseline experience that you're just constantly refreshing data whenever there's a mutation. It's kind of like a pretty good heuristic. Like, if someone makes a mutation, I should rerun all my loaders. You used to do this in your SWR apps.
Yes.
Now, the next answer to this, they kind of take the other side of the trade-off. They say that, okay, when you make a mutation, we're not going to rerun your pages that you have cached in the browser. We're not going to tell those to revalidate, but we're going to give you really good APIs for you to revalidate them. So you can revalidate by URL, you can revalidate by surrogate key, and they're awesome APIs for this.
Right.
But you as a developer have to know to call them.
Yes.
Okay, so that's like the theoretical argument. It makes sense that when you have a mutation, you have to go revalidate the things that mutation changed. I think my argument here is like the types of apps that I work on have all these different services with like all these crazy different behaviors, and you can point to the services and you can say, oh, their behavior's wrong. For example, we have one service that we use that fires webhook events with the wrong data that's been changed.
Right.
So it's like an edit happens, they fire a webhook event, you go to get the new data, the data is actually the old data, and then 30 seconds later, the new data shows up. Again, you can point to that service and say it's totally architected wrong, but that is a service like we have to deal with. We just have, we have our users in Firebase, we have our content in the CMS, just all these apps that I work on. I want to use Prisma Studio. I want to use the PHPMyAdmin type apps to edit data. So I think this is where I get a little like
theoretical versus the. So yes, I think I know what you're saying now. Let's tease apart the two user flows that cause this frustration and confusion, both for us and for other people, right? If you have a Rails app open driven by a CMS, you change the CMS. You don't see the new data, and that's fine. That's expected. But as soon as you start clicking around, you do.
Yes. Yes.
In Next, you don't, because of the client-side cache. So you have to click refresh in the browser.
Yes.
So that is confusing and a hard baseline. However, if you're looking at the summary on Build UI, a page, and you haven't clicked around, and you change something and you wanted it to push an update, then you would still, even if you didn't have the cache, you would still need a solution similar to yours where you pull in an interval and do a diff check or whatever in the same way you would on Rails. So the two things are really, it's once you start navigating around, that's the one thing.
Yes.
The other is how to show updates if I'm just looking at the site. And that is something that is still part of the ethos of how people expect websites to work. So they wouldn't, I think normally you would say, oh, it's changed. I had to refresh or I had to click home again. That's expected. Eventually, you know, kind of like Yehuda used to say, the goal should be like the user should never have to like click refresh. They should never have to do anything. If there's new data and you have a rich app, it shows you. You know, Apple Notes, you're typing in a note, and your friend starts making edits, you see activity, you see highlighting. That's like, that should be the ceiling. And that's like what we should have the tools to build that kind of thing. But teasing apart that situation where you're looking at something and a backend service changes and you want to handle that, that's like 5% or 10%. The 90% is something's changed, whether I had a form open in another browser tab or I change data in a CMS. When I start clicking links in the app, then I'm going to see the freshest version of the data. And that's where the cache is causing problems and confusion, and breaking that, basically lowering that baseline. So in the same way that suspense and transitions and server components have brought that baseline of navigating around a static site that loads data, not static, a site that loads data back to where the MPA is, I think we both could agree we would like to see that baseline for mutations and seeing fresh data brought back to that baseline, so that you can't make a Next app if you follow in the conventions where you make a change, clicking a link is the same as clicking the refresh button, because the fact that those two are different, you click a link to go home, or you're on the home page and you click refresh, you see two different things. That's a really big point of confusion.
That's a great point. You nailed it. That absolutely nailed it. It's if you click a link to go home and you're on the home page and you click refresh, I would tell you those are the same, but they're not.
They're different, even if nothing's changed in the back end between those. Right. You have the back end change at time t0. You click index at time t1, you see something. You click the refresh button in the browser at time t2, you see something else. That's confusing.
Yeah. Yep.
I think eventually it'll get there. And I think today the way you would do it is if you could basically just start with the caches disabled, and that would just basically get you there, right? Because then if you didn't have the client side cache, I guess so in Remix you don't have caching. However, parent layout segments aren't re-rendered when you navigate, so that is also a case where clicking a tab would give you a different page than clicking the refresh button would.
Yes,
which is also confusing, and can be confusing. So there should be a way to opt out of all that stuff, I think.
Totally.
There's another vision where, like, I think the other vision they're working towards is any mutation either by the user through a form or through an external system is wired up to purge a list of surrogate keys from a cache to evict it, so that every client that's connected to the site knows that, and that way, anytime they take a user action, we know we have to re-render these parts of it. But that's obviously like would be nice in theory, but like as you said in practice, like that's a lot of work. And
I think I would just say like there are cases where it's not doable, or practical. If it is doable, it requires like a backend to pull some service.
Webhook from Stripe and from Firebase and from Highgraph to say whether a user's changed, a subscription change, or a video's change. If you had an easy way to do all that, now you can drop in a polling component. Your whole site can be completely reactive. It can feel like an offline app or whatever, a cloud, whatever. But that's a big ask. It shouldn't be. You should be able to progressively get there, enhance your app to get to that point. The baseline should be clicking. You should be able to do a thing where you click a link and you just rerun everything, And Remix, just to Remix's credit, by default, they don't re-render parent layouts when you change, but there's a way to say that you can. And so you can say like should revalidate or whatever.
It's like should reload. You like
should reload. Even if you're changing a nested segment of the URL, you want to rerun the layout. So that way, if you have notifications in this nested segment, but also in the header, those are always going to agree. Something like that.
Yep.
So
I guess one area where like I'm willing to like take a step back from everything we just said. If the idea is like in order to build a really rich app that is getting real-time updates and it's like a website, but it feels like a Apple app, a desktop app. If this caching stuff is like a requirement of that, you need to start with that to get to that ceiling level experience. Right. So I'm willing to say like, I guess I'm willing to have like my mind change that like, yeah, the baseline will not be good, but when you start off with that difficult to use baseline, it's easier to get to the ceiling. So that's an area where, because there are
that's the charitable like argument, the best argument for why we have to deal with this in the beginning. It's kind of like saying, it's almost like reminds me like strict mode, where like it makes it harder, but it's you're doing it there because you something you want, the goal at the end is going to be better. Right.
There are absolutely like magic moments in Next where you are editing stuff and you're calling revalidate inside a server action because the edit is happening through your app on your page. And yeah, everything just feels instant and fast. And you have prefetching, you go to click links, everything just renders instantly. So I guess I'm like, I can see some benefits of having the cache. Yeah, I think prefetching is a really good example here. I can see some benefits of having the cache and being able to instantly render, and like the developer getting control over that with prefetching with these revalidate APIs. So I guess like I will say I'm willing to be convinced that since there are solutions to all these problems we're bringing up, like polling into the server telling the client needs to re-render, or the server forcing the client to re-render. Since there's solutions to all these caching problems, just as you learn these solutions, there'll be better ways. And when you start with a cache by default, you build a better experience. But yeah, I will say it's really confusing right now.
Today it's very confusing. Today it's hard, and the baseline is much lower, and it's easy to ship something that doesn't work the way most people would expect. Yeah. I like that you said like the magic moments, like when you see a prefetch work or an update happen, even though you didn't do anything because you're polling it, and you also don't get like a janky re-render because of React stiffing. It reminds me like, yeah, the first time we used Firebase and you're building a website, you know, we built this little app in like 15 minutes using Firebase at a TED conference where someone could send a message to someone on the stage. So we had 2 routes in the app, and you just, you just update some data for like, it was like one piece of data in a Firebase store. It's called message. And the display route read it. The other route showed it and also let you update it. And you didn't have to do anything, to make that happen. And that didn't feel like building a website, even though we were using web tech, which was awesome. I think that's the kind of thing a lot of people like us in the front end community like and want to build more of, and want it to be easier. So
isn't it interesting though, with the Firebase site is really good example, because when we built that, there's a lot of like imperative code in the sense that like an update happens, like you're the sender, I'm trying to send a message to you. So like I type in a message and an update happens, but the way you get notified that that update happened is like your client app starts polling or has some WebSocket connection. But really it's weird because I'm the one sending the update. I should be able to tell you that like your data's changed. So I think that's like a nice thing where the revalidate stuff comes in. But I guess this is I'm just going in circles here. So that's something where I'm like pro the revalidate stuff. But then now like the update has to go through your website and all that stuff.
Yeah. No, I think there's a world where you get the boundaries better. What's cool about Firebase is for that case, the client page subscribed to that data, and then we just wanted to update it whenever it changed.
Yeah.
And that was perfect use case for Firebase because that's what they do by default. And but it's like all or nothing. And we didn't even have to write any code for that because we didn't have to poll because that was what the library did for us. So it's very declarative. But you don't have the intermediate control. And so there's a world where we get the intermediate control through all the things you're talking about, but you can still make that kind of app very easily using the same tech you would make to use the Twitter show new tweets or the Stack Overflow. And because of that extra control you have, something's changed. How do you want to handle it? Oh, React re-render, show some new toast, whatever. So that's exciting to me, and I want to see that gradient of complexity commensurately increase with the complexity that your UI needs. But I want the bottom, the baseline, to feel like what we expect and what we know without extra code. I think as long as people are writing sites like they are today, and people expect that clicking a link to the homepage should show the same thing that you do if you were to then click refresh on it, if nothing in the backend system has changed, that to me still feels like the way people think about it, both on the users who use websites and developers who write them. That should be supported as the baseline case, and it should be easy to do without extra wiring.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There's really, it's kind of interesting because like in order to build that app where you can like send messages, you end up opting in a tech like Firebase because they handle
Right.
the database and they handle the WebSocket and they handle like the, oh, data's changed, refresh it in this client and cause a re-render or whatever. But that's like kind of a big leap because now you have
It's
to
a huge
opt
leap.
in.
It's
You
a
have to
huge
opt
leap.
into Firebase. You have to opt into a new service, a new database. So it is, like you said, that gradient of complexity. Being able to start with Prisma and being like, oh, I edited data. Now I come over here and I click the reload button and I see that new data, or I navigate and I see that new data. But then being able to slowly layer in those pieces like cache, like write or refresh, like some
Exactly,
sort
dude.
of
You want to layer
revalidate.
it in. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm signed in as an admin to build UI. And if my current user is an admin and I'm looking at a video, then I'm going to set up something equivalent to the Firebase because I know I'm not I'm not making a mutation for build UI. But if this page ever changes, I just want to reload it. And so I want the Firebase behavior. How easy is it for me to add that to this specific route for this specific user with the tech that I started out with, you know?
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So I think that's the dream. At least that's my dream. But it is cool that the tools are there. It's a little the gradient's not as smooth as it could be, but I think it will. I think it will be more and more over time. And I'd like to see that component. We'll have to put that up in a recipe, the polling thing, because I think that's a great use case because that's a real problem we have, right? How would we set this up for a page? We don't want to set that up for users. They don't, if they see a typo or whatever, they'll eventually get the new one when they click around or visit it later. But if you're an admin, you're likely authoring, especially for a video that's in draft mode, let's say, you're likely authoring. And so you just want to see it as fast as possible without doing anything. So you can just write in the CMS. That'd be very cool, like use case for how easily you could add that behavior. So
For sure. Yeah.
cool.
Cool. I do
man.
think, just to wrap this, I do think that we will get here and your vision will be realized one day. Because I do see all the building blocks in place. It's just
Totally.
there's just a lot you as a developer have to hold in your head to get this stuff working.
Yeah. And like we could have had this conversation about navigating and loading data a couple of years ago and look at where we are today with that, where, we've both worked on Rails apps where the initial page is slowed down by one part of it. Recommendations, man, sure would be nice if we could show the talk of the day right away. It's the same for everybody. It's really hard to do that kind of thing in a Rails app. I mean, you basically can't, or you end up, the jump there is huge because you move the things to a service and now you're not using Rails anymore, basically, just because it's really important to show the talk of the day right away and get the time to first byte there.
Dude, with Rails, it's you're no longer data fetching in a controller. You move all your data fetching to the front end, and the front end kicks off AJAX requests for all the stuff that you want to show after the initial render. And it's just,
that's not even a gradient. It's not even, you're abandoning the architecture. So I think the fact that the architecture today with server components and Suspense lets you move from this homepage is really slow because it's big to I want to show the talk of the day immediately and lazy load everything else in. You haven't. It's an incredible story. It's the best. It's incredible.
Say nothing about your data fetching changes.
Right.
Nothing about your rendering changes.
Right.
You just
They just
throw
being
a
fetched
few
in the same
suspense.
spot.
You throw a few suspense boundaries on your page, and that's how you defer rendering of those data fetches.
Yeah, pretty amazing, and that solves real problems for people. Not people who when you're starting, but definitely real problems for sure. So
right, because a Rails developer can take a very theoretical approach and just say, oh, index all your data, make all your queries fast. Your queries shouldn't be slow. But the reality is, like, we all have to interface with these external systems, and it's just very easy for some external system to be a legacy system that takes 3 seconds to respond, and we don't have control over it.
Yep, that's a great point. Cool.
Okay.
Cool. That was fun discussion. I like that. Sweet. Why don't we wrap it up?
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. Again, by the time this comes out, your data fetching with React Server Components course should be up on Build UI, so check out a link for that in the show notes. How long is it? About 2 hours or something like that?
I think it's going to be a little over an hour.
A little over an hour.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it's quick. We cover a lot of stuff,
That's good. That's good. So if you've been wondering how to make sure you're using the URL correctly, not using client-side state unnecessarily, or trying to sync things with search params, but still have interactivity and respond to input events, all that good stuff, I think it's a nice example of kind of the React Server Component paradigm being used to build something that's, again, has a nice baseline, but has some enhancements to it. So be sure to check that out. Otherwise, we'll talk to y'all next week. Bye.
See ya.